Good morning, class. My name is Victor Guerreri, and I'm a student here at Southwestern College of Professional Studies. I have a very simple question to ask. What kind of environment do we want to leave for our future generations? Now, this is an open-ended question. Everybody has a different opinion, and I found that out this week with our assignment to brainstorm about what environment means, or actually what comes to mind when you think of environment right off the bat. And some of my brainstorming ideas were what I figured out afterwards were kind of the general response, and that's pollution, water contamination, and overuse of herbicides is one of the ones that I used, and a lot of things along that line. And it was after I brainstormed and wrote these down that I went back and I actually thought about environment, and it has to deal with a whole lot of other things. The environment that we were brought up, your work environment, of course, the environment outside. But for me, I think that environment, and the reason why I came up with those topics that I think everybody came up with right off the bat, was because that's the part that we see in the news every day. They talk about global warming. They talk about the water problem in Flint, Michigan. They talk about, the oil and gas industry and the emissions that are being put out. So out of my 5 topics, I picked one that hits close to home, literally, and that is a recent upturn in earthquakes that a lot of people feel are caused by a new, or not a new, but an operation in Oklahoma, northern Oklahoma and southern Kansas, and it's called fracking or shale fracturing. I want to kind of give you an introduction to it and kind of explain what the process is and what some of the problems are that we've noticed here in the past few years in south central Kansas and in northern Oklahoma around these operations. So I'll go over a brief history of what fracking is and the wastewater that's generated from fracking, kind of what some of the scientific claims are and some of the data that's out there that people are looking at. And then finally, what's being done about the whole fracking process and the regulations and so on. So to get started, fracking or hydraulic fracturing, they call it, is a method that the oil and gas companies have been using for many years. And I didn't realize until I started researching this that this is a form of oil and gas exploration that started back in the 60s. Colorado and the Rocky Ford out in Colorado was a chemical treatment facility, disposal facility. And back in the 60s, I was growing up in the Denver metro area. And after I read this article, I was like, I remember that as a kid, these earthquakes and laying in bed at night and feeling my room shake. And it came down to the plant was injecting this wastewater deep into the ground. And injecting the wastewater they felt was creating hydraulic pressure in these rock formations in the ground, which was lubricating the rocks and creating these small mini earthquakes. And they were forced to stop this process. And this was back in the late 60s and early 70s. Now today, this hydraulic fracking or breaking up of the rock, if you think about it, the oil and gas industry are looking for new and better ways to find the resources that we currently use as American citizens. So if you think of the layer of oil shale down there, and inside of this oil shale is trapped these pockets of oil or gas or whatever the company is after. They drill a hole down into this oil shale layer and they force a combination of sand, some chemicals, water into this area to expand it or to break this rock up. And when this rock gets broken up in the ground, it releases the oil or the natural gas, which is then pumped up to the surface. But in this oil and natural gas that's pumped up to the surface is also the wastewater. Now, this type of fracking creates huge amounts of wastewater. So as they receive, or as they clear out the oil and gas, they have these huge amounts of wastewater, which they send over to a second well, which is called a wastewater injection well, which takes this material and forces it back down into the ground under high pressure and releases it under the ground. this is a process that's been going on for a long time, and there's huge reservoirs of oil and natural gas under the ground that require this type of process to get it out of the ground. Texas, New Jersey, Colorado, Oklahoma, of course, Arkansas, Pennsylvania. They have all these pockets around the country, and they know where they're at. But the only way to extract the material that they're after, whether it's oil or gas, out of the ground is by using this fracking process. Because if you drill down through this oil shale, you'll hit a small pocket, you'll pull a little bit of oil or gas out, and then you drill down a little bit farther, and you don't know exactly where these pockets are at. So there's two studies that I looked at. In the first study, and I have to read it here, I'm sorry because it's kind of lengthy, but it's called The Sharp Increase in Central Oklahoma Seismicity Since 2008 Induced by Massive Wastewater Injection. Now, we'll call this the Kernan study to make it easy, because that's the author of the person that wrote it. The second article is Injection Wells Blamed in Oklahoma Earthquakes, and we'll call this one just the Hand study to make it easy. So we got the Kernan study and the Hand study. Both these studies were posted in the Journal of Science in July of 2014. The Kernan study came out the day before the Hand study. Now, both these studies look at the recent upturn of earthquakes in Oklahoma, and they focus on the oil and gas industry and this fracking process and the wastewater management or injection that's going on to retrieve these large pockets of oil and gas out of the ground. Both studies suggest that there's not a definitive answer or a definitive way that they said, yes, this is exactly what's causing these earthquakes. But they do show data that shows a rise in the earthquake rate in this part of the country over the last couple of years. The Kernan study shows from 1978 to 2008, Oklahoma was hit with an average of just 2 earthquakes a year. Since 2008, they've been hit with 207 quakes as of last year, and unknown how many they've had so far for this year. Now, both studies have looked at the history or over time, and the scientists agree that the fracking process does cause what they call micro earthquakes, but they are so small that they don't register on the Richter scale, which is what they use to register earthquakes. But since 2014, we've had 207 3 on the Richter scale or above earthquakes in Oklahoma and south central Kansas area. Now, fracking itself has been previously linked to earthquakes, and I've already mentioned that, small ones. But now the scientists believe that it's not necessarily the fracking process that is creating these earthquakes, but it's the wastewater injection that's creating these earthquakes. In injecting this wastewater back down into the ground, what they're looking at is that it is creating a hydraulic pressure underneath the ground, increasing the hydraulic pressure underneath the ground, and it's also lubricating some of these hidden fault lines and fault lines that haven't moved in hundreds of years. And that's what's creating these earthquakes, is this injection of the wastewater. So the scientific community is looking at ways to manage this injection. Right now, regulatory, there is not a limit of the amount of pressure that they can put down in the ground. And the deeper these wells go, the more pressure they need to have to push this wastewater down into the ground. Also, the makeup of the soil that they're putting it into, the rock formations they're putting it into, requires different pressures. Now, one study that the Hand study suggests, or that looks at in this report, says that if they monitor the amount of pressure they put back into the ground, they might be able to reduce these earthquakes. But there's not a definitive answer as of yet on what that pressure is. In 1962 and 66, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal was studied, and they shut these wells down. Today, they're taking that information that was derived from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which is in Denver, Colorado, and they're starting to apply it to what's going on in south central Kansas and what has happened over the years in different states, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, with some of these earthquakes and the rise of earthquakes. and so on. And so the U.S. Geological Society characterizes pre-fracking quakes, they call it, as so small that they don't register. The Carnahan or the Karanen and the Hand articles published last July in the Journal of Science pointed out that the rise in number of earthquakes are part of a 40-fold increase in seismicity within Oklahoma during 2008 through 2013. Now, the public looks at these studies, and we as lay people look at these studies and they say, well, it's obvious. All right, this process is creating earthquakes, so stop it. But the gas and oil companies have no definitive proof that fracking and wastewater disposal are creating these earthquakes. So we have the scientific community that is saying one thing, the oil and gas industry, which is saying we have no definitive proof, so we're going to keep doing it. And then we have we as citizens that are looking at this information and saying, if there's a rise in earthquakes, and the earthquakes started about the time that they started this fracking process in these injection wells in Oklahoma, they have to be related. To me, that makes common sense. They have to be related. So in mitigating in mitigating this, the regulatory agency through the United States government has taken a stronger stance on the amount and the type of fracking and wastewater that is created. They don't have a definitive answer, but what they have required the oil and gas industries to do is to work with the U.S. Geological Society to monitor what they are doing on a daily basis. So the amount of pressure they're putting in the ground, the amount of wastewater they're putting in the ground, they have to log, they have to data, they have to analyze all of this information and share it with the United States Geological Society. Now, there are states out there, Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Arkansas, that per the state governor have put restrictions and regulations on the oil and gas industry in their states until they can figure out this problem. If this is directly associated to the earthquakes that are being felt in this part of the country. Specifically, I can tell you here at the house, we felt these earthquakes. There's been times that I've either been in here doing schoolwork or watching TV downstairs or laying in bed at night watching the news that you feel this little rumble. And my wife and I look at each other and we're like, did you feel that? I felt that. And then the newscasters, hey, we just had an earthquake. So with this regulation, the Hand article discusses the enactment of new requirements and orders the scale back of disposal operations issued by the governor in Oklahoma. The Corporation for Commission and Regulators in Ohio, Arkansas, and Colorado have done approximately the same thing with the gas companies in their states. Texas is also considering regulations governing fracking of wastewater. The oil and gas industry, they're there to make money. And the only way they can make money is by pulling these resources out of the ground and selling it. We as citizens see this as a huge issue because what kind of environment do we want to leave for our children? We're pulling all of these resources out of the ground. We are shoving the waste products of these resources back down into the ground and creating different problems for our future generations. Some of these fracking practices and wastewater injection practices haven't been directly blamed with the pollution of drinking water systems around the country, but they are seriously looking into it. How do you regulate when you put this wastewater in the ground? How do you regulate or how do you control where it's going? So this being such an old, when I say old, that it goes back to the 60s process for pulling these resources out of the ground. In today's world of we've been doing it for so long, why all of a sudden are people starting to complain about it? Well, technology over time has increased. They have learned how to do this more productive and better. And with that, like anything else, the process exponentiates. It gets bigger. They can pull more oil and gas out of the ground. They can shove more wastewater back down into the ground. They can make more money. You know, it goes round and round. So the gas and oil companies are not going to stop this process until there's definitive proof that it's hurting the environment. But to me, isn't that kind of the way that we've done things all along? We do it and we do it and we do it and we use up these resources until there's proof that, oh, we hurt the environment. We better stop now. We better find something new. I am a big proponent of finding a better way to do things. A lot of people complain about these wind farms in this part of the country. I love the wind farms in this part of the country. They don't really hurt the environment. People call it an eyesore. Well, I'd rather see a big turbine spinning out in the middle of an open pasture with cattle grazing underneath it than I would a giant nuclear or coal plant spewing black smoke out of the stacks as I drive by. I think there's warrant to this process. And I think this is a process that is viable for the United States and for our future. But I also feel that in lieu of making a quick dollar, we need to take a step back and really figure out if this is creating the earthquakes and if there's a limit that we can do as far as the amount of wastewater we put back in the ground, the type of wastewater we put back in the ground, and if these fracking processes really are in the best interest of our country. The oil and gas statement, or the oil and gas oil and gas advocacy group Energy in Depth told CBS, the best science available to us right now suggests strongly that fracking has nothing to do at all with small seismic events. And in a way, they're right. Data suggests possibly that they're right. Mike Terry of the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association told NBC Nightly News in June, ultimately it takes time. It takes a lot of data and it takes scientists to figure this out. It goes back to my earlier statement. How long do we wait until we figure out that this process is not good for our environment? I don't want to pass on a horrible environment to my children. I don't want it passed on to my grandchildren. I don't want it passed on to future generations. I believe in taking care of our environment. I have a beautiful home. I live on about an acre. I have 2 lakes behind the house. I take care of that. And I try and do what's right. And I think that if everybody kind of has that attitude, it will filter up through government and into a situation to where the oil and gas companies have to take serious note if this is the right avenue for exploration of oil and gas. I hope that this has informed you a little bit on some situations going on here in South Central Kansas and the Oklahoma area. For those of you that were stationed here or that are from here, hopefully that gives you a little bit more information. It definitely gave me a lot more information. Reading through all this research and looking at it gave me a lot more information on exactly what's going on in my home area. And hopefully I was able to pass that on to you. Thank you. Have a good day.